Night fell heavy over the Philippine Sea, a thick tropical darkness that swallowed sound and distance alike. And beneath that black ceiling, steel fleets moved without knowing how close fate already was. The destroyer cut through the water alone, its bow slicing a narrow white scar that vanished as quickly as it formed. She was small by battleship standards, a lean gray knife against the immensity of the ocean, carrying men who understood exactly what the night could bring. Radar screens glowed faintly, voices stayed low, and every sailor felt the same pressure in the chest, the sense that history was tightening around them. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 5 Japanese battleships were moving as one, their massive WWIIs displacing the sea with unstoppable confidence, their guns capable of tearing a destroyer apart in seconds. This was not supposed to be a fair fight, and everyone on both sides knew it. The Pacific War had reached a stage where numbers and firepower usually decided everything. Yet on this night, the balance would be tested by courage, confusion, and decisions made in minutes that would echo for decades. The destroyer's captain stood on the bridge, eyes fixed forward, listening to reports come in from radar and lookouts. He knew the odds were absurd. A single destroyer against 5 battleships was the kind of scenario planners dismissed as impossible or suicidal. Destroyers were escorts, screens, fast attackers, meant to harass and protect larger ships, not to stand alone against the heaviest units in an enemy fleet. But war rarely followed doctrine. Earlier engagements, miscommunications, and the chaos of battle had stripped away support until only this one ship remained on a collision course with overwhelming force. The captain's mind raced through options, none of them good. Turning away might save the ship for a few hours, but it would leave others exposed. Charging forward could delay the enemy, disrupt their formation, maybe even force them to hesitate. That hesitation could be everything. Sailors moved automatically, performing drills they had practiced hundreds of times, their faces lit by red battle lights. Fear was present, but it was controlled, compartmentalized the same way the ship itself was divided by watertight doors. Some men thought of home, others focused on the task in front of them, and a few felt a strange calm, the kind that comes when the worst outcome is already understood and there's nothing left to debate. Ammunition was fed, torpedoes were readied, and damage control teams prepared for hits they all assumed would come. The Japanese battleships advanced in disciplined silence, their commanders confident in their superiority, or destroyers that could be chased off by a bold maneuver. These were floating fortresses, armored giants that had been built for decisive fleet engagements. Their crews trusted their guns, their armor, and their training. Radar contacts reported a lone enemy ship ahead, small and fast. It barely registered as a threat. Yet doctrine required caution, especially at night, when even a single destroyer could launch torpedoes capable of crippling a capital ship. Orders were given to maintain formation, to prepare secondary batteries, and to be ready for evasive maneuvers if needed. The imbalance of power was obvious, but war had taught both sides never to underestimate an opponent, no matter how small. As the distance closed, the destroyer's radar confirmed what the captain already suspected. Multiple large contacts, spaced in a line, moving steadily. 5 battleships. The decision was communicated through orders passed down the chain, simple and clear. Increase speed. Prepare to engage. Launch when in range. The ship leaned slightly as engines pushed harder, the bow lifting just enough for the crew to feel the acceleration. In that moment, the destroyer committed to its final run, a course that would lead directly into the shadow of giants. Night combat was a different kind of warfare, one defined by uncertainty and sudden violence. Visibility was limited, stars obscured by clouds, and the sea reflected only fragments of light. Sound carried strangely, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. Both sides relied heavily on instruments, but human judgment still mattered. On the battleships, gunners waited for orders, hands resting on controls connected to weapons that could fire shells weighing more than. Japanese secondary guns opened up, flashes briefly illuminating the silhouettes of their own ships. Shells splashed into the water around the destroyer, tall columns rising and falling with violent force. Each splash was a reminder of how close death already was. The destroyer weaved, changing course slightly, speed fluctuating just enough to throw off aim. The captain watched the patterns, trying to predict where the next salvo would land. He knew that a direct hit from even a secondary gun could cripple the ship. A main battery hit would simply end everything. On board the destroyer, the sound of shells landing nearby was overwhelming, a mix of crashing water and concussive shockwaves that rattled teeth and equipment. Yet the ship remained intact, threading through the danger with surprising agility. The crew responded with their own fire, smaller guns barking back into the night. The destroyer's shells were insignificant compared to battleship armor, but they served a purpose, forcing the enemy to react, to track, to divert attention. This was not about sinking battleships with gunfire. It was about creating an opening. The torpedo officer reported readiness. Long steel weapons rested in their tubes, each one carrying enough explosive power to change the course of the battle if it found its mark. Torpedoes were the great equalizer, the reason even the largest ships respected destroyers. A single hit could flood compartments, reduce speed, or force a battleship out of formation. The captain waited, judging distance and angle, knowing there would be only one good chance. Launch too early and the torpedoes might miss or be evaded. As the destroyer closed in, Japanese fire intensified. Searchlights snapped on, brilliant beams cutting through the darkness, sweeping the sea in wide arcs. One beam found the destroyer, locking onto its hull and painting it in harsh white light. In an instant, the small ship went from shadow to target. Every gun that could bear swung toward that illuminated shape. This was the moment they had all anticipated, the point where survival became a matter of seconds. The captain did not hesitate. Orders were given rapidly, voice steady despite the chaos. The destroyer turned sharply, engines screaming as it attempted to brake. The searchlight's grip. Shells landed closer now, fragments tearing through the air, metal screaming as near misses sent shrapnel across decks. One hit struck the superstructure, tearing into equipment and injuring men who had been standing moments earlier. Damage control teams moved instantly, sealing compartments, treating wounds, keeping the ship alive. Through smoke and fire, the destroyer pressed on. The range was closing fast, dangerously fast. The torpedo officer called out distances, numbers dropping with each passing second. The captain watched the enemy formation, noting the slight changes in course as battleships attempted to maneuver. He knew they were wary of torpedoes now, that caution was creeping in. That caution was the destroyer's weapon. At the critical moment, the order was given, torpedoes away. One by one, they left their tubes, splashing into the sea and disappearing into the darkness, running toward targets that dwarfed the ship that launched them. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. The destroyer turned hard, beginning its escape, engines pushed beyond what they had been designed to sustain. Behind her, the torpedoes raced on, silent and deadly. The Japanese battleships reacted instantly. Lookouts shouted warnings, helmsmen spun wheels, massive ships began slow, ponderous turns, their size working against them. Guns continued to fire, but now their priority had shifted. Avoid the torpedoes. Break formation if necessary. The confidence that had defined their advance was replaced by urgency. Even a near miss could cause damage, and no commander wanted to be the one who lost a battleship to a single destroyer. Shells continued to fall around the fleeing destroyer. One struck near the waterline, sending a violent shudder through the hull. Compartments flooded, alarms sounded, and the ship's speed dropped. The crew fought to contain the damage, pumping water, reinforcing bulkheads, refusing to give in. The captain knew the ship was wounded, but she was still moving, still alive. He pushed her forward, knowing that every minute bought was a minute the enemy was not advancing freely. In the distance, explosions erupted as torpedoes reached the end of their runs. Whether they hit or forced evasive maneuvers mattered less than the result. The Japanese formation was disrupted, their advance slowed, their attention consumed by a threat that should not have existed. The destroyer, battered and bleeding, continued into the night, its final run not yet complete. This was only the beginning of a confrontation that would test the limits of undue. The destroyer limped onward through the darkness, smoke trailing behind her like a wounded animal refusing to fall. Inside the ship, the situation was grim but controlled, the kind of controlled chaos only sailors under fire could maintain. Water sloshed in damaged compartments, pumps throbbed relentlessly, and injured men were moved aside so others could take their stations. No one spoke about retreat or surrender. The unspoken understanding was simple. As long as the ship could move, and her weapons could fire, the fight was not over. The captain absorbed reports with a steady expression, mentally calculating how much speed remained, how much damage could still be absorbed, and how long the enemy would take to reorganize after the torpedo threat. Behind them, the Japanese battleships struggled to reform. Massive hulls carved wide arcs through the sea, engines straining as helmsmen obeyed emergency orders. The sudden appearance of torpedoes had shattered the clean geometry of their advance, forcing each ship to think for itself rather than as part of a unified line. Commanders exchanged rapid signals, trying to regain cohesion without exposing themselves further. Even without confirmed hits, the destroyer's attack had succeeded in its first objective. Momentum was lost, confidence shaken, and precious minutes were slipping away. Searchlights flickered on and off as Japanese crews tried to reacquire the target. Smoke and darkness blended together, turning the battlefield into a shifting maze of shadows. Radar operators strained to separate real contacts from echoes and interference. The destroyer appeared, vanished, then reappeared in fragments on their screens, never quite staying where it was expected to be. Orders were given to continue firing, to press the attack, to finish the lone ship that dared to challenge battleships. Pride was now involved, and pride could be dangerous. On the destroyer's bridge, the captain adjusted course slightly, using the ship's remaining agility to keep distance while staying close enough to remain a distraction. He understood that escape was unlikely, but total destruction was not inevitable either. If he could draw the enemy farther off course, if he could keep their guns focused on him instead of more vulnerable ships elsewhere, then the mission was still being fulfilled. War was not always about survival. Sometimes it was about buying time with steel and blood. A sudden impact rocked the ship, sharper and more violent than the near misses before. A shell had found its mark, punching into the hull and detonating inside. The blast knocked men off their feet, lights flickered, and for a terrifying second, it seemed the destroyer might simply break apart. Damage control teams rushed toward the smoke and fire, sealing doors, dragging hoses, and pulling wounded sailors clear of the flames. The smell of burning paint and hot metal filled the air, mixing with salt and oil. Despite the damage, the engines continued to turn. Speed dropped again, but the ship still answered the helm. The captain clenched his jaw, feeling the loss not just in numbers, but in the way the deck vibrated beneath his boots. Every hit narrowed their margin, reduced their options, and brought the end closer. Yet the crew's response was immediate and disciplined. There was no panic, only urgency. Each man understood that his actions now affected everyone else on board. The Japanese gunners, encouraged by the hit, intensified their fire. Secondary batteries raked the sea ahead of the destroyer, trying to bracket her path. Water erupted in violent columns, some so close they drenched the decks. Shrapnel tore through exposed equipment, shredding antennas and lifelines. One gun crew was wiped out in an instant, their position left twisted and silent. Others stepped in without waiting for orders, hauling ammunition, manning weapons, refusing to let a single mount fall silent if it could still function. In the midst of this, the torpedo officer reported that their tubes were empty. There would be no second strike. The destroyer had played its strongest card, and now it had to rely on speed, maneuver, and stubbornness. The captain acknowledged the report with a nod. He had expected nothing else. This phase of the fight was about endurance, about seeing how long a small ship could stay alive under the gaze of giants. On the battleships, damage reports were still being assessed. One ship reported a near miss that had shaken her hull and flooded a compartment. Another had been forced into a hard turn that strained engines and reduced speed. No catastrophic damage had been inflicted, but the threat had been real enough to force caution. Commanders debated whether to press aggressively or maintain distance, and finish the destroyer methodically. Night battles favored the defender as much as the attacker, and even now there was uncertainty about what other enemy forces might be nearby. The destroyer's captain sensed that hesitation and exploited it. He ordered a brief course change toward the enemy, a move so bold it bordered on reckless. For a moment, the destroyer surged forward, guns firing again, flashes lighting up her battered silhouette. The maneuver forced the Japanese ships to adjust yet again, their fire momentarily thrown off by the unexpected change in angle. It was a calculated risk, designed not to win, but to confuse, to delay, to keep the enemy reacting instead of advancing. The return fire was brutal. Shells screamed overhead, some passing so close they could be felt as pressure waves. Another hit struck aft, destroying equipment and killing men who had been fighting fires moments earlier. The ship shuddered, and for the first time there was a sense that the end might be imminent. Reports from below indicated flooding was worsening, pumps struggling to keep up. The captain listened, then made a decision that would define the rest of the engagement. He ordered maximum speed, even if it meant pushing damaged engines beyond safe limits. The destroyer surged ahead, engines protesting with harsh vibrations and uneven rhythms. Men braced themselves against bulkheads as the ship strained, every bolt and plate under stress. The goal was no longer maneuvering or counterattacking. The goal was distance. If the destroyer could pull far enough away, she might disappear into the darkness once more, forcing the battleships to either pursue blindly or abandon the chase. The Japanese commanders faced a choice of their own. Chasing a wounded destroyer deeper into uncertain waters at night carried risks, especially with fuel considerations and the possibility of running into additional enemy forces. Yet allowing the destroyer to escape felt like an insult, a stain on honor and reputation. Orders were given to continue pursuit, but with caution. Speed increased, guns remained ready, and searchlights once again probed the darkness ahead. The destroyer weaved, using every trick learned through years of training and combat. Small course changes, speed fluctuations, bursts of smoke, all designed to keep the enemy guessing. Each maneuver cost fuel and stressed the ship further, but they also kept her alive. Inside, exhaustion was setting in. Men moved more slowly. Hands shook from adrenaline and fatigue, and injuries took their toll. Still, no one abandoned their post. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The distance between hunter and hunted changed constantly, sometimes narrowing, sometimes widening, never stable. Occasionally, a searchlight would catch the destroyer again, triggering another storm of fire. Each time, smoke and maneuver saved her, but the margin grew thinner. The ship was bleeding speed, systems failing one by one, the cumulative damage impossible to ignore. Finally, a critical report reached the bridge. Engine output was dropping dangerously. One more push might result in complete failure. The captain absorbed the news in silence. He knew what it meant. The destroyer could not run forever. Soon, whether by choice or by force, she would have to face whatever came next. He looked out into the darkness, imagining the massive shapes that followed, and understood that this night was not just about survival or destruction. It was about defiance. As the destroyer slowed, the Japanese ships began to close again. Their guns adjusted, their formation tightening with renewed confidence. The imbalance of power reasserted itself, cold and undeniable. Yet even now, the destroyer refused to simply die. She fired back whenever possible, her remaining guns barking defiantly into the night. Each flash was a declaration that she was still there, still fighting, still forcing the enemy to account for her presence. The sea around the ship was churned into chaos, waves and shell splashes merging into a violent landscape of sound and motion. Smoke hung low, illuminated intermittently by gunfire and searchlights. It was a scene of destruction and resolve, of steel and human will colliding under a starless sky. The final run was reaching its climax, and everyone involved knew that. Whatever happened next would be remembered long after the echoes of gunfire faded into the Pacific night. Here is par. It is approximately 2,000 words. English, one continuous flow, no headings, no breaks. As the Johnston slipped beneath the surface, the men left behind in the water watched smoke and fire dominate the horizon, unaware that the sacrifice they had just witnessed was already reshaping the battle. The Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming strength, was no longer advancing with confidence. Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato, struggling to understand the chaotic reports flooding in from his commanders. Enemy destroyers were charging battleships. Escort carriers were launching wave after wave of aircraft with reckless aggression. Torpedoes were appearing from unexpected angles. The orderly plan to smash the American landing force at Leyte had dissolved into uncertainty. Kurita believed he was facing a far larger and more dangerous American task force than intelligence had predicted. The audacity of the destroyer attack suggested desperation, but also concealment. No fleet commander would throw away ships so casually unless something greater was at stake. That assumption proved decisive. While Johnston's survivors drifted amid wreckage, other American destroyers carried on the fight she had begun. USS Hull charged into the same wall of steel, launching torpedoes at battleships and drawing fire that ripped her apart. USS Herman threaded between enemy salvos, firing torpedoes so close that Japanese gunners could see the flashes from her tubes. Destroyer escorts, ships never meant for fleet combat, joined the melee, firing everything they had at cruisers many times their size. Above them, American pilots attacked relentlessly. Some aircraft carried no bombs, some had only machine guns, but they dove anyway, strafing decks and bridges, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver violently. Every turn disrupted firing solutions, every evasive action cost time. Time was the one resource Kurita could not afford to waste. The invasion fleet at Leyte lay exposed beyond the horizon, but the path toward it was clogged with smoke, confusion, and resistance that refused to break. Reports came in of cruisers damaged, of destroyers sunk, of torpedo tracks forcing battleships to sheer away. The psychological weight of Johnston's charge lingered in every decision. Kurita had already lost several cruisers earlier in the battle to submarine and air attack. Now facing what appeared to be a determined screen of surface ships and constant airstrikes, he began to doubt whether pressing forward was worth the risk. Yamato's massive guns had fired, but there was no decisive blow, no clear destruction of enemy carriers. Instead, the American ships kept fighting, even as they burned and sank. This behavior contradicted everything Japanese doctrine expected from a defeated enemy. Doctrine assumed withdrawal under overwhelming fire, not escalation. As the battle stretched on, Kurita ordered a temporary withdrawal to regroup, a move that sealed the fate of the operation. The moment passed. The chance to strike the invasion fleet slipped away. By the time he reconsidered, American resistance had hardened, and the tactical situation no longer favored a breakthrough. In the water, Johnston's survivors clung to life, some wounded, some burned, all exhausted. They watched Japanese ships pass nearby, too busy with the larger battle to finish them off. Hours later, many would be rescued, though others would succumb to wounds or exposure. Their destroyer was gone, but its impact was indelible. News of the battle spread rapidly through the U.S. Navy. Initial reports struggled to capture the scale of what had happened. How had escort carriers and destroyers driven off a battleship fleet? How had a single destroyer attacked the strongest surface force Japan could assemble? As after-action reports were compiled, the picture became clearer. Johnston's charge had been the opening blow in a defensive battle defined by initiative, rather than firepower. Commander Evans's decision to attack without orders had forced the Japanese to react instead of execute their plan. That reaction cascaded through the enemy formation, multiplying the effect of every subsequent American action. In naval warfare, momentum is often invisible but decisive. Johnston seized it at the moment it mattered most. The destroyer's gunnery, though incapable of penetrating battleship armor, had inflicted real damage on cruisers, knocking out radar, starting fires, killing crewmen, and degrading command and control. Her torpedoes, even when they missed, forced evasive maneuvers that broke formation. Her smoke screen concealed the carriers long enough for them to escape annihilation. Each of these actions alone would have been insufficient. Together, they created a fog of war so dense that Kurita could no longer see a path to victory. In Japan, the battle would later be viewed as a tragic missed opportunity, another example of courage squandered by hesitation. In the United States, it became a story of defiance that defied the logic of tonnage and gun caliber. Yet for the men who fought it, the battle was not a legend, but a blur of noise, fear, and instinct. Johnston's crew did not know they were making history. They knew only that retreat meant death for others, and attack meant at least a chance. That calculation, brutal and simple, drove every action that morning. The last salvos fired by Johnston were not aimed at victory in the conventional sense. They were aimed at delay, disruption, and survival for those behind her. When the war ended, Johnston would be posthumously awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, and Commander Evans would receive the Medal of Honor. These honors, though significant, could never fully capture the reality of what happened off Samar. No citation could convey the sight of a destroyer charging battleships, of sailors passing ammunition through smoke and flame, of a wounded captain refusing to leave the bridge. The battle challenged assumptions held by both sides about the nature of naval power. It demonstrated that technology and numbers, while crucial, are not absolute determinants of outcome. Human decision, especially under extreme pressure, can bend the course of events. Johnston's stand did not win the war, but it preserved a critical operation at a pivotal moment. Had Kurita broken through, the invasion of Leyte could have been devastated, prolonging the war and altering its final chapters. Instead, the invasion succeeded, cutting Japan off from vital resources and accelerating its defeat. In this sense, the destroyer's sacrifice echoed far beyond the immediate battle. The sea off Samar returned to calm eventually, as seas always do, erasing the surface traces of violence. But beneath that calm lay wreckage and memory, steel and stories resting in the depths. Johnston's hull became part of the ocean floor, her name carried forward by those who survived and those who studied the battle afterward. Naval historians would debate Kurita's decision for decades, analyzing radar plots, timing, and command psychology. Yet amid all that analysis, one truth remained constant. A single destroyer, facing 5 battleships, chose to fight as if the odds did not exist. That choice altered perception, behavior, and outcome. In war, perception can be as powerful as armor. Johnston weaponized perception through courage. The Japanese saw not a lone ship, but a threat. The Americans saw not defeat, but resistance. And resistance, when it spreads, becomes something larger than any single hull or gun. As the battle faded into history, the story of Johnston endured because it represented something elemental. It showed that even in an age of industrial warfare, where victory seemed governed by production numbers and displacement tables, individual actions still mattered. The last salvo fired by the defiant destroyer was not merely a physical act. It was a statement, delivered in smoke and sound, that some lines cannot be crossed without consequence. The Japanese fleet turned away, not because it was destroyed, but because it was uncertain. That uncertainty was born in the moment a destroyer charged battleships at dawn, refusing to accept the role assigned to it by fate or doctrine. And in that refusal, history pivoted.